Okay, yes, are alien plants bad? I actually get emails quite often asking me that very question. So let's talk about it. But I have to say, I've been taken to task for using the word alien and for using the word bad. Alien kind of has negative connotations to it. You picture things like this. And they say, well, that's not fair. You're biasing the argument. So people say, well, why don't you use exotic? Well, to me, exotic, it goes the other direction. You know, striking or fascinating, strangely beautiful, enticing. I'm not sure that describes all non-native plants too. So somebody suggested out-of-towners, which I kind of like. They are all out-of-towners or introduced. And yes, they definitely are introduced plants. So I'm going to stick with that. So now we've got our title, Are Introduced Plants Bad? But again, people say, well, bad, that you're biasing the argument by saying that. And I'm going to fight back on this one because the terms good and bad are relative terms. They can be measured. They can be measured without subjectivity. So for example, let's ask the question, is Doug Tallamy good or bad at basketball? Well, it depends. If we're comparing my basketball skills to my 3-year-old granddaughter, I'm pretty good. She can't even hold the basketball. But if we compare me to LeBron James, not so good. He usually sneaks by me. So I'm going to stick with the word bad and say, are introduced plants bad? Now we have a title. Okay, the basics are that nature is built from lots and lots, literally millions of very specialized interactions, like the interaction between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They will fly up to a mile from a parent tree and bury their acorn beneath the ground. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they actually have planted a new oak tree, and oaks depend on that type of dispersal. Very specialized interaction between witch hazel and its pollinators. If you read what pollinates witch hazel, say, oh, flies and gnats and other things they make up. But if you actually go out at night, there are a group of moths called winter moths, like the bicolored sallow, that only fly in the wintertime. It's usually mid to late November. I have found them on Christmas Eve, and they're the primary pollinators of witch hazel. So it's another very, very specialized relationship. Specialized relationship between, come back here, acorn weevils and acorns. You're not going to have one without the other. A specialized relationship between many, many native bees and the plants that they depend on. This is the Andrena facilii. It's a specialist bee that won't be around unless you have Facilia. That is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them depend on the pollen of particular plants. In California, you won't have 63 species of native bees unless you have perennial sunflowers. So again, specialization is really common. This is Phlox tubericata. This is my backyard. It depends on day-flying sphinx moths. It has a tiny little corolla, very difficult for native bees to get their tongues into that. But the day-flying sphinx moths, I've got 3 species in my yard. This is the snowberry clearwing, are the primary pollinators. And of course, you won't have snowberry clearwings unless you have the larval host plant, which is coral honeysuckle. So again, specialization galore. Specialization is the rule. It's not the exception, which means when we're looking at natural systems, we can't ignore those very specialized relationships. And specialization almost always starts with plants. But today, these relationships, the ones that form most of nature, are threatened by what we call novel ecosystems. What's a novel ecosystem? That's a term that was coined by Richard Hobbs way back in 2006. And it's really most of the ecosystems today can be considered evolutionarily novel. The organisms that are in those ecosystems are just meeting each other for the first time in evolutionary history, which means they have no evolutionary history together, which means in so many cases, they do not have the adaptations that allow them to interact with each other. And that means you've lost a lot of those specialized relationships. So the question is, does that matter? Well, we're still arguing about this, believe it or not. The way we argue about it is usually focused on invasive species. Invasive species are very prominent non-native organisms. They're prominent because they don't stay where we put them. If we talk about invasive plants, you know that they move out of our yards. They start displacing native plants in natural areas. And there's still people, and some of them are scientists, to say, well, that doesn't really matter. It's okay. But we can determine whether introduced species are good or bad by asking the following question. Do introduced organisms, those novel species, the one without evolutionary histories, do they have a net positive or a net negative effect on the ecosystems they encounter? There are those. You can go to the literature and you can find the following claims, such as plant invasions are not bad. And these are the reasons that you will read they're not bad. There are no global extinctions recorded from mainland invasions. And we're going to talk about each one of these. Post-invasion species richness is higher. Birds don't care if a berry is native or non-native. Invasive communities are different, but not inappropriate. I don't know what that means. Introduced plants are here to stay, so we should embrace them. We'll talk about each one of those. It's also been claimed that we don't like introduced plants because of nativism. We just don't like anything that's outside of our tribe. Our response to introduced plants is based as much on aesthetics, morality, and politics as it is on science. Introduced species can provide important benefits to ecosystems, so therefore we should accept them. Again, we'll talk about each one of these. Finally, it's also been claimed that returning ecosystems to some mythical pristine state is a fool's errand, so we shouldn't even try. And a legitimate question, shouldn't there be a statute of limitations on being alien? So if you've been here long enough, do you become native? Okay, good questions. Mark Davis, who wrote a book about invasion biology, says this. He says, don't judge a plant by its origins, judge it by its function. And I agree 100%. So that's what we're going to do throughout this talk, is judge plants by their function. So if introduced plants, this is autumn olive, one of our major invasive species. If introduced plants are the ecological equivalents of the native plants that they displaced, then there should be no impact on ecosystem function. Our ecosystems would look differently, but they would behave, they would perform just as well. So that's the question. Do novel ecosystems, do ones that have been invaded by non-native organisms, function as well as co-evolved ecosystems, as ones where there are no non-native organisms? Well, we've got to be able to measure ecosystem function. How can we do that? That could be challenging. But it turns out that it's not challenging. Way back in 1955, a theoretical ecologist named Robert MacArthur, very famous in his time, wrote this paper. And what he said was that essentially diversity begets stability and productivity. As you increase the number of species in your ecosystem, as you increase the species richness and the diversity, then ecosystem function goes up. It becomes more stable, it becomes more productive, making more ecosystem services. But of course, the reverse is true too. As you take species away from an ecosystem, it becomes less stable and less productive. That was it was a hypothesis, really, and he did not test it, but he called it the law of nature anyway. Well, unfortunately, he died of a brain tumor very early on in his career. He was never able to test it, but a number of people have tested that hypothesis since. These are just some of the papers that have tested that hypothesis. And it turns out that MacArthur was right. They all get the same answer. As you increase the number of species in an ecosystem, the health of that ecosystem, the productivity, the stability of that ecosystem increases, which means all we have to do is count the number of species in an ecosystem when we have a good idea of how well that ecosystem is doing. So that's good news. Now we can actually measure ecosystem function. So the question becomes, do novel ecosystems contain as many species as co-evolved ecosystems? Well, that seems easy enough. We have introduced 3,300 species of plants to North America. And you might say, well, now we've got 3,300 species of plants from other continents in North America that didn't used to be here. So shouldn't our ecosystems be functioning better now? We have increased species diversity. It's a good question. The answer is, though, it's a matter of scale. It's a matter of where you measure ecosystem function. Ecosystems don't function on a continental scale. They function locally. So you have to measure whether or not after a plant invades a particular area, whether or not you have more species or fewer species. And that's the question. After a plant invasion, what happens to species richness, the species diversity? This is porcelain berry. It's a rampant invasive where I live here in Southeast Pennsylvania. Took this picture as I was driving home. No, there are not more species there, folks. That has covered whatever was there. And now all we have is porcelain berry. This is Cape May, New Jersey, major stopover point for migrating birds. We have a walnut, we have a black cherry, we have a sassafras, and something else I can't remember. I crawled in there to see what they were. Those trees were all dead because they're covered with porcelain berry. So you've taken a section here that used to have 4 or 5 species of trees and reduced it to 1 species of invasive plant. This is cheatgrass. This is what happens after cheatgrass, an introduced grass, invades a sagebrush community. Sagebrush communities are very diverse communities in the West, but cheatgrass has a very rapid burn cycle, burns at least once every 3 or 4 years. Cheatgrass burns normally about once every 40 years. So when cheatgrass invades and it burns, it kills all the cheatgrass, and then you end up with nothing but cheatgrass, fewer species. This is Melaleuca in the Everglades, the river of grass. And wherever Melaleuca has invaded, it's not the river of grass anymore, it's Melaleuca. Again, vast reduction of species diversity. Kogon grass as a ground cover in the Southeast replaces everything that was there. Phragmites, the common reed, takes a diverse marsh and turns it into a single species. Spotted knotweed in the West. This is autumn olive near my house. Invaded ecosystems typically contain far fewer species than uninvaded ecosystems. And I'm not just making that up. These are all the papers that have measured it and demonstrated that. And I stopped recording them because I ran out of room. There is no doubt that an invasion by a non-native plant, an invasive species, does not increase species richness. So the local loss of plant species is not something we should embrace. And I don't think we should name our roads after invasive species either. And if we do, I don't think we should spell it wrong. But let's reconsider. Is the number of species in an ecosystem really the appropriate metric for ecosystem function? I mean, Robert MacArthur said it was, but even before Robert MacArthur, way before Robert MacArthur, there was Alexander von Humboldt. He is the most famous biologist that you never heard of. But he was the most famous biologist of the time, and he really was the first one to realize that nature is not just a collection of species. It's a collection of interacting entities. They're not independent. They all depend on each other. So he suggested that species interactions really is the measure of stability and productivity. Much later, Dan Jansen, in 1974, working in Central America, he was very concerned about the loss of species in Central America, and he said, what escapes the eye, however, is not just the loss of these species, but something that's much more insidious kind of extinction. It's the extinction of ecological interactions. So a number of people have caught on to this and say, well, yeah, we're losing species, but we're also losing how those species interact. So now the question is, do introduced plants reduce the number of species interactions in an ecosystem? Well, now we need a good measure of interaction diversity. What can that be? There's lots of ways we can measure that. I measure it in terms of food webs, particularly insect-based food webs, because they're highly complex, and it's a great measure of how energy is moving through an ecosystem. They're also really important ecological interactions. If you don't pass energy up a food web, you don't have diversity, you don't have functioning ecosystems. So I base my work on insect food webs. They have the highest interaction diversity of any of the food webs that are out there. And I measure caterpillars because they are the primary means by which energy is moved from plants to animals. In other words, caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other organisms than any other type of plant eater. So now let's ask, what do introduced plants do to plant-insect interactions, particularly ones based on caterpillars? Well, we have measured this. We measured it in great detail in a big common garden experiment. But first, we looked at the plants that occur in the Mid-Atlantic States, and this is how we define the Mid-Atlantic States. And we went to the literature and we looked up host records, records of where caterpillars, where Lepidoptera were making a living. What plants were they depending on to reach maturity? And first, we looked at woody plants. And the answer is when you have non-native woody plants, there's a 90% reduction in caterpillar use. So serious loss of the number of species there. What happens to the caterpillars when an introduced plant is a close relative of a native plant? So for example, you have the genus Acer, that is maples. We have a lot of native maples, but we also have Norway maple. It's a non-native maple from Europe. The idea was that if caterpillars are adapted to native maples, maybe they can also eat non-native maples because of the similarity in the chemistry within that genus of plant. This is where we had the big common garden experiment. We reared native and non-native congeners, members of the same genus, 18 different pairs of them next to each other in the same argument. I'm sorry, that's my phone, and I'm in my office and I can't turn it off. So we'll just ignore that. It was a 5-year experiment, and what we found was a 65% reduction in caterpillar use, even when the introduced plant was a close relative of the native plant. So this was the total number of caterpillars we found in the native and the non-native. If we separated them into generalist species and specialist species, we got the same pattern. That was caterpillar abundance. This is species richest number of species, a 58% reduction in the number of species. Well, what happens when caterpillars encounter a plant that is not closely related to a native species? Well, then you get a bigger reduction. So for example, Ailanthus, it's not related to anything in this country. And we did a bunch of comparisons, again, in a common garden experiment, and got an 80% reduction in abundance and a 78% reduction in the number of species. So even when they're close relatives, and even when they're not close relatives, you get a tremendous loss in the number of species. That was a very controlled common garden experiment, but it's not what happens in nature. In nature, you get the biggest thugs moving into an area, displacing native plants. So we thought it'd be useful to go into natural areas and simply measure what's happening to caterpillar communities. We chose hedgerows that were invaded. Here we have autumn olive and multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and so on, and compared the caterpillar community and hedgerows that were not invaded with anything. And we found a 68% reduction in the number of species in those invaded hedgerows, a 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars. But what about biomass? That's the actual measure of the energy flow that is moving through an ecosystem. And there we got a 96% reduction in the amount of energy. So if you're thinking of energy like it's the caterpillars, are they bird food? You've reduced the amount of bird food by 96%, a huge hit on that food web. What about interaction diversity? Remember, we said that's going to be the thing that we really should be talking about. Well, there's an 84% reduction in interaction richness. We actually measured how these different organisms were interacting with their host plant, but that didn't measure how all the parasitoids and the birds and everything else that ate those caterpillars interacted with them. So in a very conservative measure of interaction richness, this still was an 84% reduction. So non-native plants are not very good at supporting native food webs. That's what that boils down to. Why is that? Why do we have such a reduction in insect herbivores? Well, this is because insects need to specialize on a particular plant to be able to eat it. Plants don't want insects to eat them. They protect their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals. So in order to get around those chemicals, insects have to develop specialized adaptations that allow them to circumvent those defenses. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. and they can only eat the plant after they've interacted with it over a long period of evolutionary history to build up specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the exposure of the insect to those compounds. And of course, once the insect does specialize on a particular plant, it's locked into eating that plant. It can't just switch off to another one without another whole period of adaptation. Let's use the monarch butterfly as an example. We all know about monarchs, beautiful butterflies, and we also know that they are specialists on milkweeds. And many of us know that milkweeds are toxic plants. They protect their tissues with cardiac glycosides. If you eat a lot of milkweed, it will stop your heart. I used to say it gives you a heart attack, but there was a physician in the audience once that said, no, it doesn't give you a heart attack. It just stops your heart. All right, good protection. All right, we know that. And we also know that monarchs are adapted to those cardiac glycosides. They put them in their tissue so that they end up tasting bad. And it's a great example of specialization. But what about the sticky latex sap that is in milkweeds? You know, when you break open a milkweed vein, all this white goo comes out. When that's exposed to oxygen, to air, it gels. It becomes like chewing gum. And that's a defense. If a caterpillar gets this white goo on its mouth parts, it glues its mouth parts together, and then it starves to death. So not only do milkweeds have cardiac glycosides, they also have sticky latex sap that glues caterpillar mouth parts shut. So how do monarchs deal with that? Well, this is something you can actually watch in your yard. Watch a monarch butterfly. It'll crawl onto a new milkweed leaf. And the first thing it does is it crawls to the end of the leaf and it starts to eat. And if any latex sap starts to come out at all, it'll stop eating, turn around, crawl back up the leaf, maybe 2/3 of the way, and then it starts to chew through the midrib. And it chews until it has completely severed the midrib. And what it's done is block the flow of latex sap from this end of the leaf to this end of the leaf, and it renders all of this end of the leaf latex free. So then the monarch can turn around, go back down, and start eating the leaf without any latex sap coming out at all. It's a very simple behavioral adaptation to this plant defense that allows monarchs to eat milkweeds when most other insects haven't figured that out. Because they've chewed through the midrib, it often flags the leaf. So you can actually tell whether a patch of milkweed has monarchs in it or not by looking for flagged leaves. So those are the upsides of specialization. The monarch is able to handle a toxic plant that has multiple defenses by physiological and behavioral adaptations. But there is a downside to specialization. And that is that they get locked into eating milkweeds at all. So that works fine as long as there's milkweeds around. But if we take milkweeds out of our local environment, the monarch disappears because it can't eat anything else. Okay, another question that people wonder about is whether generalists. Remember I said 90% of the insects that eat plants are specialists, just like the monarch. But that leaves 10% that are not. They can eat a number of different plants. And maybe the loss of those specialists are made up for by generalists that can eat many different plants. We did a series of experiments where we took generalist insects that are recorded on a number of different plants, and we grew them on, we raised them on non-native plants to see how well they did and compared it to how well they did on their native host plants. So we chose, Luna moth was one of our examples. They're recorded on 25 genera of native plants. And then we reared them from egg hatch until they reached pupation, until they pupated. And we compared their final weight at pupation. That was our measure of how well they did. So these are all non-native plants here. Sweet gum is the native host that it does best on around here. And look, they died on all of those non-native plants. They grew a little bit on rough cinquefoil for just a short period of time, and then they finally died on that as well. So this generalist was not able to handle the non-native plants at all. What about bagworm? That's even more of a generalist. It's recorded on something like 88 host plants. Excuse me. Did the same experiment, and it did a little bit better. So it didn't die immediately on all of these, died on these right away, but grew a little bit on these guys. This is its favorite hosts where we did this experiment. But none of them, it did not complete its development on any of the non-native plants. So even a super generalist like bagworm couldn't handle those plants. We kept going up. The white-marked tussock mouth is the second most generalized caterpillar in the entire country. Same pattern though, it did a little bit better, but did not complete its development on anything except its native hosts. So being generalists is not going to save the day. Our generalists are not going to be able to eat these non-native plants and provide caterpillar biomass for food webs. But then we can ask the question, what is a generalist? Usually it's something that has a host list of many different plants. Well, we took Luna moths again, and what we did was look at all the host plants that are listed in the literature as being hosts for Luna moth, and we took a population of Luna moths from the eastern shore of Maryland, where their host plant really is sweet gum. Excuse me. And we reared them on all of their recorded host plants. And look, on many of them, they died immediately. On several others, they didn't do well at all, died eventually. On walnut, they did actually reach the pupation, but they were just a little bit more than half the size when they were on sweet gum. So what this says is, as you move around the country, these generalists specialize on particular plants in different regions. So even though they have a big host list in different parts of the country, in any one place, they actually have a very small host list. And on the eastern shore of Maryland, Luna moth is going to do well in sweet gum and just about nothing else. So introduced plants destroy food web interactions. A lot of experiments there just to convince you of that. And here are the publications that we have to outline that in case you want to really get into the weeds. The reason I show you this is I have read on the internet. I've read on the internet that Tallamy admits all of his work is anecdotal. What? Tallamy does not admit that. It's peer-reviewed publications, some in Nature, some in very good journals. So you can read all about it. But you know what? You don't have to believe me. You can test this yourself. Do what I call the 12 by 12 experiment. So this is 12 feet by 12 feet, staked out. This is actually my yard in front of my house here. You get to determine how much life is going to exist in this space by determining what plants are there. And you can measure it. You don't have to read anything. You can measure how well caterpillars do on these different types of plants. You can keep it as grass and go in there and count all the caterpillars at the end of the week. There won't be any. And even if you find one, you're going to mow it on Saturday and kill it. Or we can put a tree in there. Let's put a white oak in that space. If you look at the stretch of those branches, it fills that 12 by 12 space very nicely. Now we can count the caterpillars that are occurring on this tree. I'm getting old. I don't climb much anymore. So I just walked around and counted the caterpillars that are on the lower branches. And I did it on July 25th of 2014, and I found 410 caterpillars from 19 different species on this tree. And then I stood back and took a picture of that tree. Is that the picture? No, let's get back. Right there. So I could ask you, how many caterpillars do you see? You don't see any. How much caterpillar damage do you see? You don't see that either. But if I knocked on your door and said, hey, you got 410 caterpillars on your oak tree, most people would freak out. Oh, get the spray can, call the man, save the tree. You don't have to save the tree. Oaks and other trees are very good at providing some energy to caterpillars so that you have a viable food web in your yard. I did the same 12 by 12 experiment on black cherry the same day, went around, counted the caterpillars, got 239 caterpillars from 14 different species. These are two very productive trees in my yard. Then I went to my neighbor's yard, who has a lot of calorie pears, a non-native Bradford pear, you might know it as. They had 36 calorie pears, as a matter of fact. So the first thing I had to do was choose which one I was going to measure. 12 by 12 experiment, count the caterpillars as high up as I could reach. I found one caterpillar from one species. Then I went to his burning bush, another non-native plant. Both of these are highly invasive, by the way. 4 caterpillars from one species. So huge difference between the productive natives and the non-natives. So that was one replicate of an experiment. When you do an experiment, you want to do it over and over and over again to see whether the pattern you get is real or whether you got it by chance. So let's do this experiment again the next day on July 26th, using the same species, but different individuals. I got different numbers, but I got the same pattern. 233 on another white oak, 53 caterpillars on black cherry, 2 in the burning bush, and 1 on calorie pear. And if I did it 1,000 times, that is the same pattern I would get. These native plants are going to support a whole lot more life than these non-native plants, because our caterpillars are not adapted to eating these particular plants. Rick Dark and I gave a talk in Williamsburg, Virginia, several years ago, and we drove up across the Bay Bridge on the eastern shore of Maryland on the way home. And after you cross the bridge, the first institution you get to here is the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill. And there are all the calorie pears in full bloom. So that's the tree they like. That is what they landscaped with. Okay. They have the right to do that. We kept driving. The very next property was this one, which was thoroughly invaded with the offspring from the calorie pears in the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill. So now we have to revisit that property rights thing. They have the right to plant anything they want, but do they have the right to biologically pollute all the land around them, which is exactly what they've done. And this is a new way of thinking. We haven't been thinking about this very much, but there are consequences to planting invasive non-native plants that go beyond our particular properties. We have to stop thinking of our properties as if everything stays there. Our properties are not like Las Vegas, where what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens on our property does not stay on our property. So we have to landscape with that in mind. And we're not fooling the birds when we create novel ecosystems, when we bring in these plants from someplace else. I'm going to share a little bit of data from one of my grad students, former grad students, Desiree Narango, who worked with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And what she did was follow the breeding success of a whole bunch of chickadees over a 5-year period. This is the breeding territory of one pair. They forage about 50 meters from the nest. And the blue areas represent the trees on which they did 90% of their foraging. Little star here is where the nest was. So let's look at which plants they were actually getting caterpillars from. It was basswood, sweet gum, American elm, black cherry, a couple of willow oaks, and pin oaks. That supplied 90% of the food for that pair of chickadees. But let's also look at the plants they did not forage on. And that was all the non-native plants that are used as ornamentals in this neighborhood. Japanese maples, silk tree, ginkgo, black poplar, crepe myrtles, leyland cypress, saucer magnolia. And these are the trees, of course, that we landscape with all the time. And it's very easy to find a neighborhood where these are the trees that are dominating our landscape. And when that's the case, you're not getting any caterpillars. You're not going to have breeding chickadees or anything else. She also measured the number of migrating birds that stopped on her properties. Migrating birds they fly at night and they get tired. They can fly up to 300 miles in a single trip. So then they come down during the day and people say they're resting, but what they're really doing is refueling. They lose up to 50% of their body weight when they're migrating on a flight, and they have to replenish that body weight by eating insects, primarily caterpillars. And if they come down in the land of ginkgo or any of the other non-natives that we typically use, they're out of luck, because there is no food there, and they're also out of energy, so it's often the end of their migration. So a lot of people say, well, I don't have a property big enough to support a breeding bird, and that could be true. But if you have a population big enough to support a single tree, and you make it the right tree, if you make it a tree that's going to support food for those migrants, then you can help those birds as they move north to breed. Okay, another question that was asked is, do birds care whether a berry is native or not? There's a paper out there that says, no, they don't care. Well, let's look closely at that. The relationship between birds and berries is another co-evolved relationship. Plants make berries so that the birds will eat them. They use birds as seed dispersers. The birds eat the berry, then they fly, they digest the berry and fly off and then poop out the seed someplace else. They have moved the seed a good distance from the plant. So plants make berries to attract birds at the time of year they want their seed dispersed. If they make berries during the summer, they make those berries full of sugar. because the birds have just come off a breeding season where they're feeding their young lots and lots of insects that are high in fat and high in protein, but very low in carbohydrates. So things like blueberries and elderberry that are produced during the summer, birds love them, and they get their berries dispersed. In the fall, though, birds need berries that are high in fat. Because migrating birds use the energy from fat to migrate. There's twice as much energy in fat as there is in sugar. And birds that are not migrating, like the chickadee here, will use fat from berries to make it through the winter. They build up their fat supplies. This is poison ivy, by the way, and it has very rich berries that are very rich in fat. So in the fall, we want high fat berries for the birds. And later in the winter, you want a spike in carbohydrates again. So this is winter berry. Many of our native hollies will make berries that are inedible early in the spring or in the winter. They don't taste very good, but after they've thawed and frozen several times, so maybe March, then the sugar content spikes. And this is what the birds want just before they start breeding. They want to have a heavy load of carbohydrates before they switch to the high fat and high protein insects. That's the phenology. That's the sequence of nutritional events that birds are depending on. So let's look at what they actually get when we compare native berries versus non-native berries. These are a bunch of native berries, and look, they're all very high in fat. Myrica pennsylvanica, wax myrtle, native viburnums, near 50% fat, spicebush, 48% fat, dogwoods, high in fat, even Virginia creeper, 24% fat. That's high compared to the non-natives, the invasive species that we've got out there. Multiflora rose, less than 1%. The native, the non-native honeysuckles, both bush honeysuckle and Japanese honeysuckle, 0.7, less than 1% fat. Buckthorn, 0.5%. Autumn olive, 2% fat. Oriental bittersweet, 2%. So very low levels of fat, which is what those birds need in the fall. They're high sugar berries in the fall when the birds need high fat berries. So the pattern that's emerging, and this work was done by Susan Pagoda Smith, or Smith Pagoda, she got married. The pattern that's emerging is that the berries, particularly from plants in Asia, are producing high sugar berries when our birds need high fat berries. And other studies have shown that when there's a choice, our birds do eat those high sugar berries because there's usually no other option. But when they do have both available, when they have native berries that are high in fat and non-native berries high in sugar, they will choose the high fat berries. And that is something that wasn't known when that original paper was written. Okay, if an alien plant supports a particular butterfly, bee, or beetle, it's contributing to an ecosystem. And that's true. It is. But that's a very narrow way of looking at it. That's like saying Hitler was a great guy because he made the trains work on time. You can't look at just one thing. You've got to look at the net impact. There's something gained from these plants, but there's also something lost. And you have to measure both ends of it and see what the net benefit or loss is from a particular plant. So let's do that with kudzu. You all know about kudzu. This is, it kills trees, covers everything. But look, the silver-spotted skipper has adapted to eating kudzu. It's a legume eater, so it was pretty good at it to begin with. I know it eats kudzu because I unrolled a kudzu leaf and there's the larva of the silver-spotted skipper. So the silver-spotted skipper is supporting that type of butterfly. The kudzu is supporting that type of butterfly. But what is lost when you have a kudzu invasion? You got nothing but kudzu. All of the violets are lost because it's covered with kudzu. And if you lose the violets, you lose your fritillaries. Your milkweed's lost, which means you lose the monarch and all the other things that eat milkweed, like the giant milkweed bug and the milkweed tussock moth and the milkweed beetle and other things. It covers the bushes like spicebush, and you will lose 11 species of Lepidoptera, of caterpillars on spicebush. When it covers greenbrier, you lose 19 species. When it covers Virginia creeper, you lose 32 species. When it covers sweetgum, you lose 35 species. When it covers hackberry, you lose 43 species. Viburnum support 104 species. They're all lost during a kudzu invasion. Goldenrod, 110 species. Black walnut, 129 species. Elm, 215 species. Maple support 297 species. They are lost too to kudzu. And of course, those oaks, 557 species. This is just in the Mid-Atlantic States. And a small tree like this is not going to survive a kudzu invasion. And then, of course, you're going to lose all the birds that depend on all of those caterpillars. Birds need thousands of caterpillars to rear their young. So we gain the silver-spotted skipper, but we lose thousands of other species. You've got to consider the net change in the interactions before we judge whether introduced species are good or bad. Okay, returning to ecosystems to some mythical pristine state, is a fool's errand. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not trying. We recognize that yet too many things have changed. We're not going to be able to restore ecosystems to some point in the past. What we want to restore are the specialized interactions that comprise ecosystem function so that you have a functioning ecosystem again. It's not some mythical pristine state. It's just ecosystem function, and that is not a fool's errand. Shouldn't there be a statute of limitations on being non-native? Good question. Well, an introduced plant becomes a native when it starts to act like a native, when its function equals that of a native plant. How do we know what the function of these introduced plants are? We go to where they came from and look at how they're doing there. So Phragmites, the common reed, for example, comes from Europe, where it supports 170 species of insects. It has been in this country for nearly 400 years, and so far only 5 species are using it. Is it close to acting like a native? No. Eucalyptus, stellalita in California, supports 48 species in Australia, where it comes from. In California, only 1, and it's been here 100 years. Melaleuca in Florida, 409 species in Australia, where it's actually a rare tree. Only 8 species have adapted to it in Florida. So these plants, even though they've been here well over 100 years, are not close to performing the way natives do perform. So adaptation happens, but it's very, very slow. The statute of limitations is going to be measured in thousands of years, not just single lifespans. We don't like introduced plants because of nativism. To me, that makes no sense at all, because we love introduced plants. You go to a nursery, 80% of the plants sold there are introduced plants, and everybody loves them. It has nothing to do with nativism. Our response to introduced plants is based as much on aesthetics, morality, and politics as it is on science. The person who made that statement didn't read any of the science. There's a bunch of science out there, and at least my response to it is based on science. It has nothing to do with aesthetics. You know, the non-natives are really pretty. Morality, politics, it's based on data. So let's revisit the plant invasions are not bad statement. No global extinctions recorded from mainland invasions. Not yet, not yet. There's plenty, by the way, from island invasions. But here are a couple that are going to happen very soon. American bittersweet is hybridizing with Oriental bittersweet, and red mulberry is hybridizing with white mulberry. And through integration, the results of the hybridization is the loss of the native genotype, and you get the pure non-native genotype. So we're going to lose American bittersweet and red mulberry to Oriental bittersweet and white mulberry in really just a very few years. You have to go to Maine now to find American bittersweet. It's gone from the Mid-Atlantic States, and you have to go to Texas to find the a true red mulberry because of integration. Everything else is now white mulberry. Post-invasion species richness is higher. No, it's not. Not locally where ecosystems function. It is much, much lower. Birds don't care if a berry is native or not. Yes, they actually do. They do care. Invasive communities are different, but not inappropriate. I still don't know what that means. Introduced plants are here to stay, so we should embrace them. What does that mean? Cancer is here to stay, but that doesn't mean we need to embrace it. So our original question, are introduced plants bad? Well, they're bad at supporting insects compared to native plants. They're bad at supporting the things that eat insects, insectivores. They're bad at supporting specialist pollinators. We didn't even talk about that. at supporting complex food webs, stable food webs, local diversity, interaction diversity, ecosystem function. We can measure all of those things, and introduced plants do not measure up. So that's it. Thank you very much.